After subduing the kingdom of Commagene and putting affairs in Syria in order, Antony returned to Athens. He left two of his generals, Sosius and Canidius, behind to take advantage of the Parthians' weakness and push them back even further. In another move, Antony sent Publius Ventidius to Rome to attend the first celebration honoring victory over the Parthians. In the Parthian Empire, the situation was in turmoil. According to Cassius Dio, the aging Parthian king withdrew from public affairs after learning of his eldest son's death, entrusting the throne to another son, Phraates. However, Plutarch tells a different story, claiming that Phraates killed his father to seize the throne. Regardless of how Phraates came to power, both historians agree he ruled oppressively. He killed all the sons born to his father's marriage with the daughter of Antiochus I, since they possessed a superior lineage. And when Antiochus I protested, Phraates ordered his execution as well. These harsh actions, along with his cruel treatment of other noble families, caused many to turn against him. The Romans took advantage of Parthia's internal troubles, extending their power and influence in the region. Canidius, tasked by Antony with overseeing the Caucasus, managed to bring Armenia back into the Republic's sphere and broadened Roman influence even further by choosing kings for Iberia and Albania. Another of Antony's generals, Sosius, who governed Cilicia and Syria on his behalf, was charged with suppressing a Jewish revolt. Aristobulus, installed by the Parthians to govern Judea, led a major uprising against the Romans. After numerous skirmishes, Sosius managed by 37 BC to brutally quash the Jewish rebellion, placing Herod in charge of Judea instead. The Romans also made an example of the Nabateans, who had aided the Parthians. With military operations underway in the Caucasus, northern Mesopotamia, Judea, and Arabia, it became clear the Romans were preparing to strike at Parthia. The only remaining concern for Antony was to ensure Italy was secured. At this time, Sextus Pompey had rebelled, once again wresting control of Sicily from the Republic. Antony and Octavius came to a new agreement to settle their differences. Antony promised Octavius the fleet he needed to fight Sextus. In return, Octavius would provide troops for Antony's war against Parthia. Both leaders agreed, and to strengthen their pact, Antony arranged a marriage between his son and Octavius's daughter. With Italy now stabilized, Antony could turn his full attention to Parthia. In 37 BC, he left Italy and took up residence in Antioch. When Antony arrived in Syria, several Parthian nobles, including Moneses, sought refuge with him. Antony was delighted, as Moneses promised to lead the Roman army against the Parthians and capture a large part of the Parthian Empire in Antony's name. Antony named him commander for the war against Parthia and granted him governance over 3 Roman cities. Alarmed by Moneses' alliance with Antony, Phraates sent envoys to persuade Moneses to return, offering him whatever he desired if he did so. Although Antony was angered by Moneses' dealings with Phraates, he did not harm him. He knew that if he did, no other Parthian noble would ever seek his protection. Instead, Antony sent Moneses off with ample gifts, and he also sent envoys to begin peace talks with the Parthians. Antony proposed an end to hostilities if the Parthians returned captured Roman standards and prisoners. In reality, though, he was preparing for war, hoping the Parthians would be lulled into peace and let down their guard, leaving their borders vulnerable to a sudden Roman strike. Even as peace negotiations were underway, Antony was raising a large army. Having lost hope for reinforcements from Octavius, he refused to wait any longer. By gathering legionaries stationed across the Republic's eastern outposts, he assembled 12 legions, close to 60,000 soldiers. He then called on allied states of the Republic to send additional troops. The Iberians and Celts contributed 10,000 cavalry. Armenia provided 6,000 heavily armored riders and 7,000 infantry. Polemon I, king of Pontus, joined with a substantial force, and Cleopatra, queen of Egypt, also supplied him with an unspecified number of soldiers. Beyond that, Antony recruited about 23,000 auxiliary troops. Altogether, Mark Antony's massive army may have numbered around 110,000 men, more than double the force Crassus had once commanded. Antony led his army toward the borders of the Parthian Empire while negotiations were still ongoing. Thinking the Parthians were preoccupied with peace, he believed he would find little defense. But as he neared the Euphrates, he discovered Parthian outposts that were on full alert. Realizing he could not invade through Mesopotamia, he changed course and, under the pretext of aiding an ally against the kingdom of Media Atropatene, entered Armenia. In early August of 36 BC, Antony arrived in Armenia and learned that the king of Media Atropatene had joined forces with Phraates IV. Eager to exploit the lack of Parthian forces in the area, Antony decided to swiftly capture Atropatene. Without hesitation, he moved his troops toward Parthian territory, and by mid-August, the Romans had entered Iran. By launching his campaign in the middle of summer, Antony made his first mistake. His second was splitting his forces. Hoping to take advantage of the Parthians' absence, he marched ahead with his elite heavy troops, aiming to seize Phraaspa, the royal seat of Atropatene, as quickly as possible. Wishing to move faster, he placed his supply train, siege equipment, and much of the army's provisions under the command of Oppius Statianus, assigning him 10,000 legionaries to guard them. He also ordered Polemon I and his troops to join Statianus, with the Armenians, 6,000 heavy cavalry and 7,000 infantry following behind. Once separated from his supply train, Antony rapidly reached the walls of Phraaspa. He immediately commanded his forces to construct a fortified camp and began building a ramp near the city walls in preparation for an attack. Thanks to their efficient intelligence networks, the Parthians soon learned of Antony's advance. Phraates and his 40,000-strong force sprang into action. Knowing Phraaspa's defenses could hold off the Romans for a while, the king chose not to confront Antony directly and instead turned his sights on Statianus. Guided by the Medes, who knew the region well, the Parthians quickly caught up with Statianus's forces. Hiding in the wooded mountains of Media, they waited for the Roman column to appear. Statianus, feeling safe, was on his way to join Antony. Overconfident, the Romans hadn't even taken up battle formation. The soldiers were spread out and disorganized. They were also exhausted from covering so much ground, making them easy prey for the Parthians. As soon as the Romans reached the ambush site, the war horns and drums of the Parthians reverberated through the mountains. Statianus, believing the Parthians were still preparing for battle, was completely taken by surprise. He hurriedly sent one messenger to summon Antony's help and another to call on King Artavasdes of Armenia. From the heights, the Parthian horsemen swept down like a flood, enclosing the Romans completely. There was no escape route. Though the Romans fought bravely, they could not withstand the onslaught and were eventually overrun. Most of them were killed, including Statianus and his 10,000 men, and only a few were taken prisoner, among them Polemon, king of Pontus. The Parthians then set fire to all the Roman supplies and siege equipment, which were crucial for capturing Phraaspa. The next day, news arrived that Antony and his troops were drawing near. At once, Phraates ordered his forces to withdraw. The Parthians pulled back to the mountains and concealed themselves in the forest. Antony, having left part of his army behind to continue the siege, had rushed to Statianus's aid. He arrived only to discover Statianus and his men slaughtered and his own siege equipment reduced to ash. As Antony stood there, realizing the scale of his blunder, the Parthians sounded their war horns again and charged down from the mountains at his troops. They formed a crescent formation, aiming to surround and eliminate the Romans as quickly as possible. Antony's men, however, were on full alert. Drawing on Ventidius's earlier success at Gindarus, Antony assembled a large force of slingers, whose rapid and accurate fire proved highly effective. Since slingers could hurl projectiles faster than archers could loose arrows, they were able to repel the advancing cavalry. Already tired from their battle with Statianus and harassed by the slingers, the Parthians fought on for only a few hours before deciding to retreat and engage the Romans some other time. Thus ended the first battle between Antony and Phraates. The Romans lost more than 10,000 men, while the Parthians suffered only around 80 casualties. The destruction of Statianus's 10,000-man force dealt two severe blows to Antony's campaign. First, it cost him the siege equipment and supplies he needed to capture Phraaspa. Second, when King Artavasdes of Armenia heard of the Roman defeat, he deemed it unwise to continue fighting and withdrew his forces to Armenia rather than aid Antony. After driving back the Parthians, Antony returned to his camp near Phraaspa. Rather than retreat, he decided to continue the siege. On the other side, the Parthians released Polemon, king of Pontus, after collecting a hefty ransom and then encircled the Roman camp. During the early days of the siege of Phraaspa, Antony tried repeatedly to capture the city by attacking its walls. He brought his troops out of camp, leaving a portion behind to guard against any Parthian cavalry charge, while leading the rest to scale the city walls. By building up earthen ramps, the Romans managed to reach the walls themselves. Legionaries climbed these ramps and fought the Medes positioned high above. Each time the Romans launched an assault, the defending Medes drove them back, forcing the legions to retreat empty-handed. As long as the Romans had enough provisions, they continued to fight in this manner. But when their supplies began to run low, the situation in the Roman camp changed drastically. Antony, who had initially hoped to starve the city into surrender, now found himself in almost the same predicament as those behind the walls. At first, he dispatched small Roman detachments from the camp to nearby towns and villages to gather supplies. However, the Parthians set ambushes, attacking these detachments whenever they wandered too far from camp, wiping them out to the last man. Seeing that this method wasn't working, Antony sent a much larger portion of his army to forage for food, while he stayed in camp with fewer troops to keep up the siege. Not wanting to risk their advantageous position in a large-scale fight, the Parthian cavalry withdrew, leaving the Romans free to ride out in force. Yet no sooner had the bulk of Antony's troops left than the defenders sallied forth from the city. They tore down the siege ramps and fortifications the Romans had spent weeks building, then assaulted the Roman camp itself. Although they inflicted heavy losses, they couldn't destroy the entire garrison. When the Medes saw the main Roman force returning, they quickly withdrew behind the city walls. By now, the Roman army was in dire straits. Many had been killed in these smaller skirmishes, and their supplies were nearly gone. They were forced to eat barley instead of wheat. Meanwhile, Antony, infuriated by the lack of discipline among his troops, resorted to an ancient form of punishment the Romans called decimation. 1 in every 10 soldiers was chosen at random and executed, which meant yet more of his forces were lost. The siege of Phraaspa dragged on for several months. Summer was over, and as autumn progressed, the cold crept in. This worried both Phraates and Antony. Phraates knew that if winter arrived, his own army would be hard-pressed to secure provisions. He also feared that a prolonged war might spark rebellion at home or invite invasion from his eastern neighbors. Therefore, he ordered his cavalry to avoid direct clashes with any Roman foragers who left camp in search of food, instructing them instead to make contact and spread the word that the Parthian king wished for peace. Impressed by the mercy of the Parthian ruler, the Roman soldiers praised his generosity while criticizing their own leader for insisting on continuing the war. News of this sentiment soon reached Antony, who decided to send envoys to the Parthian camp to seek peace. Roman envoys found King Phraates IV in all his splendor. He sat on his golden throne, dressed in fine Parthian attire, wearing a bashlyk, a cloak, and holding a bow whose string he toyed with. When he spotted the Roman delegation, he spoke sternly, blaming them for starting the war and disturbing the region's peace. He flatly refused to return the captured Roman standards and prisoners, but did give his word that if the Romans tore down their camp and left, he would not stand in their way. When the envoys returned to their own camp and described the meeting with Phraates, Antony grew uncertain. Part of him wanted to trust the Parthian offer of peace, but Phraates' cold, harsh demeanor also made him uneasy. Still, he decided to disband the siege and withdraw in mid-October, hoping peace might hold. The moment the Roman army pulled back, the Parthians swooped in, setting fire to the remaining siege works and looting the Roman camp that was still standing. Word of this looting horrified Antony. At first, he thought to retreat by the same route he had come, since that path lay across relatively open plateau lands. But with the news of the camp's destruction, he decided instead to take the mountain roads, believing he could better defend himself if the Parthians attacked. After 2 days of marching, Antony, believing the Parthians had abandoned pursuit, allowed his soldiers to move forward without a proper battle formation. As they advanced, they discovered their path was blocked by ditches and pits. Antony immediately realized this was Parthian handiwork. Before the Romans could regroup, they were caught off guard by the whistling arrows and war cries of Parthian cavalry swooping down from the heights. Chaos spread among the Roman ranks. Some legionaries impulsively chased after the Parthian horsemen, who would withdraw while shooting arrows backward, picking off many of their pursuers. Antony quickly ordered his own cavalry to go after the Parthians and scatter them. At the same time, he told his infantry to form up at once. They created a large square formation, positioning slingers in the middle for protection. Once every soldier was in place, Antony sent a messenger to recall his cavalry, which had strayed too far. Taking heavy casualties, the Roman horsemen retreated inside the square. By then, the main Parthian army had arrived. The Parthians surrounded the Romans, tiring them out with a rain of arrows. The legionaries crouched on one knee, shields raised, while the rows behind them held their shields overhead, creating a testudo formation that offered some protection against the arrows. From a distance, The Parthians saw the Romans on the ground and assumed they had collapsed from their wounds. Eager to finish them off, the Parthians dismounted and approached. Just then, the Romans pushed aside their shields and charged, killing many of the Parthians before the rest managed to escape back to their horses and retreat into the forest. Realizing how effective this new formation was, Antony's army marched the rest of the way back in the same manner. Even so, the Parthians made life miserable for the exhausted Romans by burning pastures, cutting off their access to water, and creating obstacles along their path. All the way to Armenia, the Romans were harassed by Parthian attacks. Most of the time, the Parthians inflicted serious damage, but on occasion, they suffered losses themselves. Some Roman officers and soldiers, disheartened by the fighting, even defected. The Parthians hanged these turncoats in front of the Roman ranks to undermine their morale. According to Cassius Dio, if the Parthians hadn't executed the defectors so openly, the entire Roman army might have surrendered. On one occasion, Antony organized a strike force of cavalry and light infantry under Flavius Gallus to confront a Parthian demolition group. Using a careful plan, the Parthians drew this strike force away from the main army, gradually encircled them, and then destroyed them, delivering another major blow to Antony's campaign. With supplies running desperately low, the Romans resorted to eating dry grass and the roots of shrubs. Some succumbed to poisonous plants, while others starved. Witnessing his men in such misery, Antony would cry out in despair, invoking the memory of the 10,000 Greek soldiers who had once managed to return home under Xenophon's leadership. After 28 days of struggle, the Roman army finally reached the Araxes River. Crossing it meant they were out of Iran and had entered Armenia. Even so, Parthian horsemen hounded them to the last moment, peppering them with arrows. Plutarch says the Parthians and Romans clashed no fewer than 18 times during Antony's campaign. By the time the Romans reached Armenia, they had lost about 34,000 men, far more than Crassus had lost at Carrhae. Despite the disastrous outcome, Antony still wanted revenge. He hoped to launch yet another campaign against Parthia, determined to redeem himself. To find out how the 50-year conflict between Rome and Parthia concludes, be sure to join us for the final episode.